Hi, Matt Barbet here. On The Daily, we're returning to prisons today, which you think are going to be a bit emptier at the end of the day. Between now and next month, around 5,500 prisoners are going to be coming out early. They're doing 40% of their sentences instead of half their sentences, which they would have expected to do. Naturally, this is being talked about as much in prisons as it is outside.
We've made up some bags for your release just to help. So we've got some tissues, a little notebook and a pen, some toothpaste and a toothbrush, just in case.
If you look online, prisoners who've come out today are saying things like all they've done inside is eat and drink and put on weight, or others are fearful of not having anywhere to go, warning this is going to have a detrimental effect on society. There are stories as well of prisoners attacking each other inside just because they know that's the only way they're going to get a cell all to themselves. So no surprise then that today's prisons report that's just come out coincidentally on the same day shows us what we probably already knew. They paint a pretty grim picture of what's going on inside our jails. It turns out that 30 out of 32 of those that were inspected were poor or insufficiently good, and the root problem is, of course, overcrowding. But it's not the only significant issue. Sky's home editor Jason Farrell will expand on all that a little bit later on. But first today, alone, 1,700 prisoners will be out a bit sooner than they expected, and our reporter Mollie Malone is outside His Majesty's Prison, Wandsworth. Mollie, what's it been like down at Wandsworth today? What have you seen? Who's been turning up? Who's been leaving? What's going on?
So I've been at Wandsworth Prison for the last hour or so, and it seems that the kind of flurry of releases that we saw this morning has slightly slowed down a little bit. But I spent the morning in Surrey, which is a women's prison. But there was a real kind of mixed bag of emotion as people were leaving this morning. There was definitely a bit of excitement this morning. Some of the women saying that they'd been discussing it on the wings and that they were sort of cheering and fist pumping, and they couldn't believe that their time had come and that they were getting released earlier. But then I spoke to one woman who said she was deeply unsettled and actually really anxious about the prospect of leaving.
Well, obviously I was grateful to get out early, but I was worried about housing more than anything. Yeah, and that's still a concern for me today as I leave the prison.
We actually disguised her identity because she didn't want to be seen, but the look on her face was one of genuine panic. I mean, she looked stressed out about what the afternoon was going to bring, let alone what the next few months were going to bring. She was leaving prison with her daughter, and both of them were sort of heading off to the council that afternoon to work out what the next steps were. They genuinely don't want to reoffend. They don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to have a difficult time for themselves, for society, for the kind of wider impact of the community. But if they are left in a situation where they don't have a house and they're kind of left idle without any purposeful activity, without kind of an immediate job, well, that is a prospect that really stresses them out.
All the work I've done on myself is just going to fall for nothing, and I just feel like prison's supposed to rehabilitate you. I've done the work to change my life, rehabilitate myself, but if I'm getting put back on the streets, then it's all for what? And it means that I'm going to end up back in here and I've changed my life. So I don't really understand the fault of the government, the way they're not really processing it properly. Do you know what I mean? It's good getting people out, but they haven't thought the next step, really, about housing and everything.
And that's crucial, isn't it?
Of course it is. Yeah, of course. Yeah. And it's not good for the people out there either, because they're going to be committing crime if they've got no accommodation.
That's something that's being replicated, those kind of fears right across the kind of prison and probation sector. There's lots of people that will be released without a home. Some of them did have accommodation spaces, but because their release was brought forward, even by that kind of 10% mark, that accommodation space was no longer there. So she was feeling genuinely anxious about where that kind of leaves her.
Should we just clear up some of the sort of misconceptions about this? I mean, again, some people think they're just throwing the doors open and any prisoner, if they fit the bill, can leave sooner than they would have done. But it's not the case, is it? It doesn't apply to all prisoners.
Exactly. Previously, these types of offenders that are being released now would previously have their automatic release points, so you'd be released at 50%. So in some senses, it's only kind of 10%. And you're right, it's not the people that would go to the kind of parole board. So that's mainly those serving life sentences, terrorists, people convicted of serious sexual or violent crimes. And the government have also put in place certain exclusions, so domestic abuse related crimes. But there are still kind of fears about the kind of loophole in the law. And there are fears kind of among victim groups, particularly the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, saying she thinks that victims are paying the price for overcrowding, that she's worried that because it's based on a sentence rather than kind of some other crimes they might have been charged for previously or their history, there's no kind of ability for prison staff, probation staff to actually say, hang on, red flag, I don't think this person should be released, because it's blanket kind of proposal, if you like.
In terms, Mollie, of the people being released slightly early, is it just they walk out of the door and off they go into the community, or are there conditions, licences, tags? What's the situation there?
Yeah, so they're released on licence, you're right, and they can be recalled to prison if they break those licence conditions. You'll have a whole range of different licence conditions imposed by probation. They'll generally serve the rest of that sentence, if they're being released at the 40% mark, on those licence conditions, and they can be recalled to prison if they then go on to break them.
Have the people you've spoken to talked about whether they have been rehabilitated enough in prison?
Again, it's a kind of mixed bag. So one woman I spoke to this morning said she had been. She said actually she'd had quite a good experience, that she was rehabilitated. She said that she felt listened to. Whereas I think you'd potentially speak to others and they say, I mean, I spoke to one woman who'd been around a couple of prisons in her time while she'd served her sentence, and she said, look, I can totally understand why the government are doing what they're doing, and that they say they have no option. They're right to say that, because they are literally bursting. You've got situations in so many prisons where people are sharing cells designed for one, many of them Victorian prisons, that are not designed to house these people. So many people will come out feeling potentially not rehabilitated, and that's where you get these fears of reoffending, and actually some would say defeats the point entirely, because if you come out, you're homeless, you're reoffending rapidly, then you're back in prison. The government are not really buying themselves time if there's not these kind of resettlement plans properly in place for people that are leaving.
Is there a concern that offenders coming out early, those kind of groups, charities that might offer them somewhere to go, they now can't cope? The pressure point has moved from in the prisons to outside to those charities, and therefore there could be problems shifted from in prisons to outside in the wider world.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, everyone you speak to in the prison and probation world knows that a stable home is really crucial to kind of integrating people back into their communities and keeping this kind of stable, crime-free sort of future. And I remember interviewing Louisa Rolfe, who is the Assistant Commissioner at the Met, and she's also the National Policing Lead for domestic abuse. And I actually asked her about it when it was kind of in its infancy, as early release was in the story. And I said, look, are you concerned about the prospect of having to police this in the community? Are you concerned about the prospects for domestic abuse victims and what it looks like? And she was actually quite upfront about it and frank and said, yeah, I am. And I spoke to someone in probation the other day who said that many of their kind of people are facing workloads of 120%, and they're really stretched. So you've got kind of across the board really worries about homelessness. If you're driven into homelessness, what are you then doing on the streets? The safety of communities and the way that those communities are policed and people are being kept safe by the probation service and the police.
Thanks very much indeed to Mollie for that outside HMP Wandsworth. Stay with us, because in a moment we'll be hearing from our Home Affairs editor, Sky's Jason Farrell, who has a wider view of the report into prisons that's also come out today. Welcome back. Now, whether it's by coincidence or by design, we're not entirely sure, but His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, has released his report today into the state of prisons. Clearly, overcrowding is a big part of that, because, of course, why would they be releasing prisoners early today if it wasn't the case? But there are other issues it raises as well. To tell me more about that, here's our Home Affairs editor, Jason Farrell. Jason, what are the main takeaways then from Charlie Taylor's report?
Well, I mean, the reasons that the prisons have become so full is to do with longer sentences that have been passed down over the years. They have increased. They've increased by about 25% over the last 10 years. More people on remand because the court systems are kind of held up. And then you've also got kind of more recalls, people coming back into prison. And then this report is really saying the consequences of this is absolute hellholes, where there's increased drug abuse, there's increased self-harm, there's increased violence within prisons as well.
Look, we've seen in recent months and years focus on certain prisons, like people will think of Wandsworth in particular, a men's prison in London, which has had problem after problem, escapees and prison guards allegedly engaging in sexual activity with prison. I mean, just you could not make it up. But the one area I'd like to sort of focus on a little bit more, if I can, is the problem of drugs within prison. They seem to be like a sieve.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of prisoners say that access to drugs is really, really easy. And there's quite an alarming stat from Lindholm Prison in this report saying that 20% of prisoners say they developed an addiction to drugs inside the prison. And I think the other thing is people moving on to harder drugs, the types of drugs that are getting into prison now. You just don't know what's in a lot of this stuff. Spice and nitazines, these are synthetic drugs that have various different quantities of opioids that might be way stronger than some of the things that these prisoners are used to taking. And there's no authority there going through and saying, how strong are these drugs? And that's why we are seeing prison deaths, people dying in their cells because they've overdosed. So that is a real concern, I think, that's kind of raised in this report.
How are the drugs getting in?
Well, I think there's three ways, really. One is that they could be taken in by visitors. I mean, it is quite difficult because visitors are screened on their way in. People from the outside sort of throwing drugs over the walls and then being collected on the other side. I spoke to a prisoner who talked about drones being flown in through windows and delivering drugs. And the third way is corrupt prison guards taking it in. There was a woman convicted last month trying to bring drugs in a carton. Park Prison in South Wales. Now, they would say it's a success that they caught her, but prisoners say that is one of the key ways of getting drugs in, corrupt prison guards.
And in terms of the inmates you've spoken to, I'm guessing they are using these because they are completely bored. They're locked up 23 hours of the day in overcrowded cells, which must be mind-numbing. So they are looking for some sort of outlet, some sort of release from that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, go into prison with mental health problems. A lot of people, their mental health problems are exacerbated by the conditions in which they're in. If people are not taking part in work roles that are offered within the prisons or training courses, and some prisoners say they apply for these roles, they just don't get them. And because there's a shortage of staff and there's an overcrowding, they don't have the facilities and the staff to allow people to come out and monitor them as much as they would perhaps like. So the alternative to that is to just keep them locked up for as long as possible in their own cells. And that does lead to greater vulnerability, boredom, as you say, and drugs as a way to kind of pass the time.
Jason, I'm really interested to hear about what some prisoners have told you. And in particular, I know there's one you've spoken to who's been in an eye-watering number of prisons. Tell me more.
Yeah, well, I spoke to Zach Griffith, who said he'd been in about 20 different prisons. And his view was that every single prison he'd been to had a drug problem, that every prison he'd been in, failed to rehabilitate prisoners. And he says he won't go back into prison, not because he felt that he was rehabilitated in prison, but he said, I don't want to lead that life. I've rehabilitated myself. That said, I was outside ISIS this morning, which is a prison right next to Belmarsh, Category B prison. It does young offenders and men. And there were people going and being picked up in cars with other men. One of them was wearing a mask who turned up, covering his face. And one of the groups, they set off in a car that absolutely reeked of cannabis as they were leaving. And the concern there is that a lot of those young men are in gangs. They've remained in their gang affiliation whilst they've been in prison. And if they're potentially gang members are kind of coming and picking them up from prison, they're only going to go back to their old life. And as one person said to me, they're potentially going to commit the same crime or even worse crimes, and they'll soon be back in prison.
But those ones who have fallen into burglary out of desperation or drugs or whatever, where they feel that they can rehabilitate themselves, like you mentioned, I'm interested to know if they're put off purely by the fact that they could go back into the pretty squalid situation that prisons provide.
Yeah, there's the counter argument, isn't there, that acts as a deterrent. You don't want to make it like a holiday camp. You don't want to make it great fun. And, prison should be a punishment. Certainly you could argue that case. But I don't think, anyone's saying that it's a good idea to have prisons where there's high levels of violence, high levels of self-harm, and high levels of drug addiction. Because once people become addicted to drugs, that is a big aggravating factor. It does cause people to go on and commit other crimes. Drugs and the proliferation of drugs in prisons is one of the biggest problems.
Does this all make the early release scheme null and void? Because we already know that reoffending is one of the biggest problems with crime anyway, and that's one of the biggest pressure points on the system, is that a lot of prisoners just end up going back in.
I think null and void is probably a little bit unfair in the sense that it will, after this release and the release in October, create 5,000 spaces, which gives them a bit more legroom when it comes to convictions. And remember, the government argument on this is, if we don't do this, the alternative is a complete breakdown of the justice system because we won't be able to send anyone to prison. So what's the alternative? Okay, people have to serve slightly shorter, 40% of their sentence. But the problem they've got is that if they've come from these prisons, as you say, that are overcrowded, they're not offering the right rehabilitation, people developing drug habits, they're actually, in the words of some prisoners I've spoken to, more likely to offend than they were before they went in. Already we know the recall rates have been going up and more people have been going back in, people breaking the conditions of their parole. It is absolutely inevitable that there will be a proportion of these guys who end up going back in. But it's a kind of chicken and egg, because if you don't create the space, you can't then have the rehabilitation programs. So it's almost like, there's a calculation by the government to increase the scheme that was already underway by the previous government to say, look, let's go early on this, go big, blame the previous government for having to do it, and let's do it now. Of course, on top of that, what they also have to do, and I did speak to the Justice Secretary about this yesterday, I said, what's your strategy now? Is it try and send fewer people to prison or build more prisons? Because you've really got, those are your options. And it seems to be that they're going to fall down on the side of build more prisons. They need more space, they need more capacity, and successive governments have failed to do that.
Because of this easing of the pressure right now with the early release, do you think this time next year, when a prison report comes out, that it might show that things have improved?
I think it's going to take a while, but I think there will be pressure on certain things to improve. And key to that is not having prisons at capacity. Currently, 75 out of 122 prisons are at 100% or over. I think Durham is the worst, at about 172% of what is seen to be a kind of reasonable capacity that is safe and manageable within the prison. So the problem they've got really is that even though this is really uncomfortable, it's still quite probably not enough to really deal with the massive problems that exist within our prisons at the moment.
Jason, thanks very much indeed. As I said right at the start of this episode, over the next month, 5,500 prisoners are going to be released earlier than they thought. So we should get a good idea fairly swiftly as to whether this is all working or not. For now, thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.